Hey everyone, you're listening to Concentrates with Dr. T, a podcast discussing cannabis science, news, and hot topics. Please remember to follow me on TikTok and Instagram. I'll leave my handles in the description below. This podcast can be found on YouTube and also Spotify. I've been wanting to talk more about social equity for some time now, and so today I'm going to begin speaking about it more. And as it would happen, Marijuana Business Daily, mjbusinessdaily.com, happened to have at least 3 social equity related articles right on their front page today. So it's encouraging to see social equity being discussed more in the cannabis mainstream news. But there's also still problems with achieving social equity, or with people who have been disadvantaged feeling like they're being excluded, as we'll see in a couple articles here that I brought up. There's also been some changes or some programs that have been implemented that make some progress towards achieving social equity, and we'll see one of those today as well. So we'll get to discuss all this today. For those who are unfamiliar with the concept of social equity, what is it? I'm sure many people will describe it in many different ways, but the way I'll describe it is that social equity is the recognition that certain groups of people have traditionally been excluded from the economic benefits derived from different industries. In recognizing that certain groups of people have been either disproportionately left out or disproportionately harmed from cannabis regulatory policies in the past, in this case, in recognizing that social equity is calling for legislation or volunteers, quite frankly, to focus on how to include people who have been disproportionately impacted in the past. So social equity is about including people who have been negatively impacted by cannabis policies in the past in the cannabis industry of the present and future. And not just having them there as workers saying, okay, yeah, we've got X% minority women and LGBTQ in the workforce here, so we're doing great. It's not just that, it's at all levels. It's got to be management, it's got to be ownership, it's got to be everything. So that's what social equity is calling for. Social equity isn't exclusive to the cannabis industry. It's being called for really across the board in all industries. It's talked about a lot, but it's talked about especially a lot in the cannabis industry. And one reason that might be is because the cannabis industry is regulated state by state right now. And so each state represents an opportunity to introduce social equity provisions by regulation. And so the government, basically, social equity provisions, rather than waiting on the goodwill of established businesses to begin to include minorities or traditionally excluded people. So who are these people? Yeah, I just mentioned it. Minorities. LGBTQ is another group that's traditionally excluded, women as well within cannabis. But some groups have been more harmed or disproportionately impacted than others. Minorities have traditionally faced a lot more policing, so adverse police events, so arresting for small amounts of drug possession, for drug sale, whatever. In fact, police using drugs as an excuse to enter minority communities and to bust them, essentially to break up their communities, to harm them, when usage rates are roughly equal between white and minority people in the United States. It remains true to this day that minorities are arrested at higher rates, prosecuted at higher rates, and given longer sentences than white people who perform the same crimes, which they shouldn't even be crimes in the first place. So that's a whole other topic. But basically right now in the cannabis industry in particular, there's a huge opportunity to introduce social equity provisions legislatively, through regulation, and through voter initiative for that matter. So I'm going to start by bringing up a couple of recent stories that are criticizing the lack of inclusion in the cannabis industry that seems to be systemic. So in this case, this first article I've brought up, First Nations fight systemic exclusion in Canadian cannabis industry. And so for any Americans that aren't familiar, First Nations are what we call Native Americans here in the USA, Native American tribes. They're called First Nations in Canada. These First Nations tribes are criticizing the rollout of the Canadian cannabis industry and claiming that there's been systemic exclusion. I'm going to read much of this article, or at least some of it, to give a good indication of what's going on and give some commentary along the way. Some Indigenous leaders believe they've been largely excluded from Canada's multi-billion-dollar legal cannabis retail and cultivation industry. That's the message Indigenous leaders delivered last month at a Senate committee studying the implementation of the country's federal cannabis law. At the Senate hearings held by the Committee on Indigenous Peoples, some Indigenous leaders called for the federal and provincial governments to engage in meaningful dialogue over a carve-out within the federal and provincial laws, allowing them to regulate cannabis in accordance with their own principles. Darcy Gray, chief of, I did not look up the pronunciation of this tribe, but chief of a certain tribe in the First Nations, said economic opportunities arising from cannabis legalization didn't seem to be part of the conversations being had between the federal government and First Nations. Essentially, we seem to be an afterthought and something to be dealt with once things were set up and the market secured by others. So we recognize familiar patterns of systemic exclusion, Gray told the committee. So some of these First Nations tribes feel that they're seeing the same thing they've seen in the past, that the government will just forge ahead without including them in conversations and maybe throw some consolations their way just to kind of them from maybe complaining too much and maybe thinking that they can, okay, we'll get them in later. But they're saying later means never, essentially, and that's probably true. So moving on. Fully legal cannabis retail and cultivation remain largely absent from Canada's Indigenous communities. On the production side, only 6 of more than 600 cannabis producers licensed by both Health Canada and the Canada Revenue Agency are located on a reserve, implying the federal government has sanctioned, directly or indirectly, very little legal cannabis production in First Nations communities. Provinces responsible for retail regulation haven't done much better. Provinces have sanctioned only a handful of stores in Indigenous communities across the country. This brings up several points, and actually I'm going to get to that in a second. I'm just going to finish a couple more paragraphs and I'll bring this all together. At the hearings, Health Canada said it operates the Indigenous Navigator Service to assist Indigenous communities' participation in the production and manufacturing of cannabis. Health Canada said there were 47 Indigenous affiliated or owned commercial producer businesses. So the Health Canada, these quotes and information below, they go on to defend themselves and say, look, there are 47 Indigenous affiliated or owned commercial producer businesses out of 600. So they're trying to say, hey, yeah, we're doing a good job. But what does affiliated or owned mean? Does owned mean, what's the percentage limit? Is it 51% to be considered Indigenous owned? Is it 25%? I don't know what the regulation is. And then Indigenous affiliated, what does that mean? Affiliated? Somebody works there is Indigenous? Is on the board of directors, an Indigenous person's on the board of directors, so that is Indigenous affiliated. I can see the criticism. And the reality of only 6 production facilities being present on Indigenous land and very few dispensaries being located on Indigenous land means that they're being excluded from jobs, and they're also being excluded from access to the medicinal benefits, the recreational benefits, all of it. So even if you're saying, okay, so a bunch of Indigenous people have producer businesses, they're across the nation, the communities themselves are being excluded. And it seems to be one of the criticisms that I'm hearing from the First Nations in Canada towards Health Canada. Going on, the regulator allows Indigenous affiliated applicants to start the license review process of their application before their facility is built, whereas non-Indigenous companies need to complete their facility before the Health Canada review can begin. And that's a huge hurdle, no doubt. Having to actually build the facility before you can even ask for the review to come in to say whether you can produce, putting it all on the line like that. So reducing that isn't nice, but that's probably why they criticize that they're given little consolations or given little scraps, because things like that are nice, but how much does it really help Indigenous people to create a business, to thrive with the business, and to help their communities? Probably minimally, right? Since 2016, Health Canada officials have participated in approximately 290 engagement sessions to discuss cannabis legalization and regulation, which has informed how Health Canada administers the Cannabis Act, an agency representative told the committee. Since 2019, Health Canada has had discussions with an increasing number of interested First Nations developing their own cannabis control measures to explore mutually beneficial cannabis arrangements within the existing framework of the Cannabis Act. So again, just this sounds exactly what the quotes from the First Nations representative said above. He said they've established these businesses, they've established the marketplace, and now they're just trying to fit us in later as an afterthought. That's exactly what he said. And moving on to this section entitled Economic Opportunity, Gray said this First Nation tribe established its own cannabis law and set up stores under interim rules. 6 years later, we're still on the outside looking in on many aspects, despite putting in place many pieces to ensure our participation in the industry, the chief told the committee. He also suggested Indigenous communities are missing out on public health benefits from regulating cannabis production and sales on reserves. Systemic barriers remain in place. Our best efforts and those of other First Nations seem to be falling on deaf ears, especially when it comes to working with the province of Quebec, he said. The chief said systemic exclusion from the legal sector sends the message that Indigenous health is of lesser importance. Meanwhile, the industry as constructed seems to be floundering and asking for relief in some way, asking for reduced regulations and tax breaks and greater advantages, Gray said. Meanwhile, we're still pushing for inclusion and a better way forward. So it sounds like, just in general, the sentiment in the cannabis industry in Canada is that it's overregulated and difficult to navigate, operate in, and make a profit. That's probably true. That's very common in regulated cannabis industries, to be overregulated to the point of snuffing them out. It's very difficult for a lot of regulating bodies to strike the balance between safe and regulated and tracked dispensing of cannabis and allowing for enough free market forces for the market to thrive and to provide jobs and economic benefit to communities and all that. I'm going to skip down to the section Absence of Meaningful Dialogue. Dwayne Nashkawa, a strategic advisor for another First Nation tribe, told the Senate committee there's been almost an entire absence of meaningful dialogue for the past few years on the part of the federal government. There's been a lot of talk about a high level of engagement with First Nations about cannabis, he said, but beyond the initial round of PowerPoint presentations and group meetings, there's been almost an entire absence of meaningful dialogue for 2 or 3 years now on the federal side. Nashkawa called for a more meaningful level of engagement from the federal government. So the overall criticism seems to be that not only are these decisions just being made about the cannabis industry, even when it comes to social equity, the federal government, represented by who? The people in power, mostly white people, are just making decisions about what social equity means and what will be useful to people who have been excluded from cannabis marketplaces and from the benefits of cannabis. So in this case, First Nations. The First Nations of Canada feel they've been excluded. They feel that they're not being listened to or heard at all. and that decisions are being made by the federal government in Canada that continue to exclude them but throw them little scraps that, oh, you can skip this process with Health Canada. You can submit your plans and they'll review them before you build the building. Whoop-de-fucking-do, quite frankly. And they're supposed to be happy about that and just shut up and sit there and deal with it. But they want more dialogue, and that needs to happen. But I'm not in control in Canada. And then we're going to move down to adverse impact section. The exclusion of Indigenous-led cannabis regulation in their communities means more than lost business opportunities, some First Nations leaders say. Tanya Perrone, elected council chief for Mohawk Council of an area, said legalization amplified some negative issues. Canada's legalization of cannabis through the enactment of the Cannabis Act was meant to address and resolve the issues that Canada was facing regarding the illicit market. Unfortunately, it has had an adverse impact on this tribe in particular and on First Nations, she told the committee. Rather than resolving any of these issues, it has actually amplified them and added to those issues. She said the main objectives of the Cannabis Act were to protect public safety and health, as well as to provide for the establishment of a diverse and competitive industry. Unfortunately, it has failed in meeting these objectives in my community, she said. There have been significant impacts with respect to public health and public safety on our jurisdiction, and all of this with no economic benefit. She said youth consumption has increased, for example. Regarding policing, she said her territory's peacekeepers lack the resources to monitor and enforce new rules. So this chief seems to be a little bit more on the more conservative side and more concerned about law enforcement, youth use, and things like that. And so while I am not particularly worried about the kids, typically in legalization environments, youth rates go down. Ultimately, what we're talking about here is that she feels that there's a lack of control that her community has over what's happening surrounding cannabis. So they're in Canada. The federal government of Canada has decided certain things, and she feels like she has no control in her community, even though she absolutely should, based on their status as a First Nations tribe. So that's what's going on with First Nations in Canada. That's just one issue I wanted to bring up. There's also criticism in Missouri in their adult use legalization referendum that was actually voted on just a couple of days ago on Election Day. And with 96% of precincts reporting, it looks like there's a pretty healthy lead for the yes vote. So it looks like this legalization effort is passing in Missouri. In fact, they're projecting that it is approved with 96% of the vote counted. So congratulations, Missouri. You're the latest recreational adult use cannabis marketplace to open up that I'm aware of. I know there was some more referenda to be voted on in other states, but just talking about Missouri, congratulations. Welcome to the adult use cannabis marketplace and all of the craziness and wonderfulness that comes along with that. Anybody that's looking for help to get a cultivation or production facility started, let me know. I consult on facility design and extraction as well as cultivation. That being said, there's a lot of criticism that's being levied towards this ballot initiative saying that it would exclude minorities. So the title of this MJ Biz Daily article is Missouri Adult Use Cannabis Measure Would Exclude Minorities, critics say. So let's just jump right in. In a departure from activist-led and funded legalization campaigns, the Missouri cannabis industry is the chief bankroller of the adult use legalization measure state voters will weigh on November 8th. Critics charge that the ballot initiative, as written, would exclude minorities and give dozens of existing medical marijuana operators in the state a head start over smaller businesses and new entrants, essentially creating a monopoly situation. So just at first glance, this is what happens in every state that has a medical marketplace and then a recreational marketplace. There's always some kind of pathway given for a medical business to become a recreational business subject to certain conditions. Now, that said, this is a lot different than when Washington legalized adult use back in 2012 with a very robust medical market, but it was all mom and pop kind of stores. They were small, they were in funky locations, basements of retail outlets, just hidden away places. The cannabis was being grown in people's houses or garages or their own little facilities on their little farms out in the woods, and then transported to these medical dispensaries where a donation was required in order to receive any cannabis. You weren't purchasing the cannabis, you were donating $30 and getting an eighth or whatever it was. So that's how that was set up. So all of those businesses in Washington were given a chance to join into the recreational marketplace first. Some of them made it, some of them didn't, because some of them were just too poor of bookkeeping. They had to prove they were paying their taxes. They meet other standard business requirements. Whatever it was, a lot of them didn't make it. Some of them did and converted successfully into adult use cannabis stores. But in Missouri, the situation is different because their medical marketplace itself is very, very new. And they were very careful in how many licenses they gave out for that, and that the businesses had to be financially prepared to make investments, to make good facilities and all that. So it's a different situation. You actually have some good established people here, good established businesses here, and they're getting a head start over anybody else that might get licenses now. But it's just a fact of the situation. What are you supposed to do? Tell them they can't sell? So really, what this brings up is, how are the other licenses given? Are they going to be given out to people in a fair manner? And are they going to create an actual competitive environment for new entrants, or an environment for just consolidation with the existing player? Great questions. So there's some criticism about that. Like the legalization laws that have passed in 19 other states, Missouri's Amendment 3 would legalize the possession, consumption, purchase, and, with some restrictions, cultivation of cannabis for anyone 21 and older. The initiative would also automatically expunge most nonviolent marijuana offenses, and it would do so via an amendment to the state constitution rather than a non-constitutional statute that could be amended by the state. There's some pros and cons to going into the Constitution of Missouri, as will become apparent later in this article. But suffice to say, I think everybody in the cannabis industry would agree that expunging the nonviolent marijuana offenses is great, something to be excited about, a result that we can be happy about and proud of, even if there are problems with this initiative, because guess what? Looks like it's passing. Looks like there's problems. So let's take our wins, though. A win is a win, right? There's going to be expungement of nonviolent marijuana offenses. A win is a win. We'll take it. I'm going to skip this part about the polls because it's a moot point. It has passed. But I'm going to bring up this point about rejected applicants up in arms, because this was in regards to when Missouri opened up a medical marijuana marketplace, medical cannabis marketplace, and they only had a certain number of licenses. They had an application process, and a lot of people felt that ended up being a corrupt process, and that certain favored people were given business licenses or cannabis licenses, while normal people or farmers that got together to form groups together were excluded. So the article says the state received thousands of applications for the total of 338 licenses issued under the MMJ program, medical marijuana program, a process that rejected applicants have denounced as opaque and suspicious, if not rigged. Nevertheless, if Amendment 3 passes, existing vertically integrated MMJ businesses called comprehensive facilities in Missouri would be able to apply for new comprehensive permits that would allow them to operate in both the medical and adult use markets as early as December 8th. Another argument for allowing the existing medical operators to enter the recreational marketplace early, or now on December 8th, is that it makes cannabis products available to the public. Do you want an idealistic scenario where you say, okay, we're not going to start recreational sales for a whole year to give new businesses a chance to build up? Or do you want to start providing to the people of Missouri right now today? I think you need to start providing. And you know what? These licenses, they're limited. These companies can't just make a new facility somewhere without another license. The overall demand of Missouri is probably going to overwhelm these existing licenses, which is why they're giving out more. So as long as new businesses are given licenses and given a chance, it should even out. It is possible to enter the industry late and become a successful brand. I know because I did it in Colorado. The medical marijuana business in Colorado was established for a long time, and even the adult use cannabis market was established in Colorado for 5 years before I got there. And there were the big brand names, the top sellers, they all existed, and we were a small no-name company at the time. And I built out the extraction, the analytical, the purification capabilities of the facility, all the extraction processes, and also the formulation for the flagship line of product. And in just a few years, about 3 years I think it was, we went from no name to top selling vape cartridge in Colorado, and it remains so today. So it is possible to get in, break in, do good work hard, and go from a no name to a top player. It's not easy in the cannabis industry, quite frankly. So let's see here. However, the measure also restricts the number of licenses granted to a single business entity under substantially common control, ownership, or management to no more than 10% of the statewide total. So it just depends on the statewide total. Currently absent from the Missouri market, however, are most of the biggest names in U.S. marijuana. Major multi-state operator Columbia Care, which agreed to be acquired by rival MSO Cresco Labs earlier this year for $2 billion, does have a presence in Missouri. Other large companies such as Proper and Greenlight, founded by Missouri residents, are more local, though other out-of-state operators have openly acknowledged interest in the Missouri market. As for smaller businesses and new entrants to the market, applications for micro-business licenses reserved for those who fulfill one of several qualifications, including an income and net worth cap and certain marijuana-related offenses, would be unavailable until 6 months after December 8th. And the health department would not have to accept applications until another 3 months after that. The kind of social equity provision, micro business licenses, won't be available for a full 6 months after the existing medical businesses are allowed to convert into adult use businesses. And the health department probably won't even begin accepting and reviewing those applications for another 3 months. And then how many months of review before these licenses are actually even issued. And micro business kind of implies that it's limited, it's going to be small, it's not going to be set up to allow for it to scale to really be competitive. So I can see where criticism for this is coming from. It seems like just a little scrap, a little handout, that is an afterthought, again, instead of being something substantial that can help minorities and other disproportionately disadvantaged groups to get into the industry and to be successful. The state would also need to grant a total of only 6 micro-business licenses in each of the state's 8 congressional districts. These micro-businesses would not be able to cultivate more than 250 cannabis plants. They would also be barred from selling their products in existing dispensaries. And they could wait up to 548 days to receive their permits. Those restrictions and the Head Start promised to existing big cannabis companies add up to a nefarious ballot measure, said Democratic State Representative Wiley Price IV. As for the equity provisions, he dismissed them as nil, all phoned in at the last minute. It's just white people white peopling, he told MJ Biz Daily. It's, hey you, do you want some scraps? Want some scraps to take home to your family? It's very blatant. So there you have it. It's harsh criticism of this micro-business license idea. They only have to give out, 48 of them in total and they can only cultivate 250 cannabis plants, and it sounds like they're being restricted to selling them only through their own dispensary. So it sounds like a cultivation dispensary kind of situation. So they can't sell their products in existing dispensaries, but from this it's unclear to me whether they could sell other products in their dispensary. So I bet they can. So I bet they can sell their own plants from their 250 plant supply. They can sell other companies' products in their dispensary, but that's it. They can't sell their plants to other dispensaries, which really limits their reach and their potential market for their brand. And that's, I can see the criticism. That's seems like just, some scraps thrown in there to appease people who are seeking true change and true social equity. Moving on, I do want to run through some of the quotes from the advocates and the dissidents of this measure, just to give some flavor to why some people thought this was a good thing and why some people thought this was a bad thing. So one quote is, "To combat the racial disparities rampant in marijuana-related arrests, our organization remains committed to opposing laws which criminalize adult use of marijuana and supporting automatic expungement of marijuana-related offenses." Being single-minded and focused on the expungement of the marijuana-related offenses, they give support. And I get that, the desire to right a wrong that's happened. But I would caution, say, we want to right that wrong, but not the wrong way. We want to make sure we do this the right way. Let's hold up. Let's wait until we have this planned out correctly. But some people say, let's move forward. A win is a win. Let's take it. Missouri shouldn't legalize marijuana without automatically expunging the thousands of criminal records for marijuana offenses that will soon be legal. Our organization stands firmly in support of this sorely needed ballot initiative. So again, we're going to focus on the automatic expungement. And that last quote also talks about the automatic expungement. It's a great thing. It's a wonderful thing. But is it worth not having a robust enough discussion about social equity and inclusion prior to drafting and passing a measure like this? So we have some arguments against. I don't think that this amendment is good for the state. It's way too much to put in our Constitution. If you think that marijuana should be decriminalized under state law, the amendment should say something to the effect of, the recreational use of marijuana in the state of Missouri is not unconstitutional and may be regulated by general statute. I don't know. That's like a lawyer, maybe. Oh, it is. Missouri Secretary of State Jay Ashcroft. That's a lawyer's, this isn't the right place to put it kind of opposition, whatever. You got to do what you got to do. And you got to make it effective and bulletproof. You don't want it to be undone by legislative action later. So that's a silly argument, if you ask me. But let's move on to this quote. "There is no reason why Missouri entrepreneurs, and particularly in minority communities, shouldn't have full access to commercial licensing opportunities. The LM22 micro-license approach is a second-class Jim Crow proposal." That is a strong criticism, and I get where he's coming from completely. To say that these social equity, these accessible licenses are going to be so limited, it's scraps. It's second class. That's what it definitely portrays. And let's say it ultimately is a good idea. Let's just say it was a good idea, it was put in there, whatever. By not including people in the dialogue up front, you've portrayed it as being a very bad idea. I don't think it's the best approach, personally. But ultimately, it's going to receive criticism because the people that it affects most, or who it's supposed to be for, weren't involved in the conversation. So I'm going to stick a fork in that topic. That's the criticism coming out against this Missouri adult use ballot initiative that has passed. So again, this is painting a picture that there's a lot of criticism about the progress of social equity within the cannabis industry, because there's a lot of missed opportunities as states create their legislation or their initiatives to legalize adult use cannabis marketplaces. there's a strong desire to expunge records to right those old wrongs. But in this rush, we're losing out on opportunities to include people who have been disproportionately negatively impacted in the past and who should be included and have huge barriers to inclusion that everybody else doesn't have. So I think that's overall in the cannabis industry, we're seeing a lot of missed opportunities for inclusion and diversity and social equity because we're rushing to legalize. And how do we remedy that? I don't know exactly. Because do we plan on, okay, this is great. This is a great start, right? We've legalized, we've expunged criminal records from low-level, nonviolent marijuana offenders. Can we fix it later now with another initiative to patch it up, add social equity provisions? But not really, because these election cycles are so long, right? When's the next time you can pass an initiative? That would be 2 years from now. And stuff happens starting December 8th. So it's water under the bridge at that point. It's going to be a hard battle to bring inclusion and social equity into the Missouri marketplace moving forward. Not impossible. Not saying it's not worth the fight. It's absolutely worth the fight. We still got to do it. But it's going to be much harder now because a lot's going to happen before there's a chance to have another voter referendum. But let's move on now to a more positive, upbeat side of a win, if you ask me, and something to look at and to model after. Because when we are talking about social equity, a lot of times that's all people do. They talk about it. And that's where it ends. They just complain that we're not getting it. And then there's no ideas offered, like how do we actually achieve that? Okay, we can make a group of licenses that are available only for people who have been adversely impacted by cannabis prohibition in the past. And they can get those licenses, but then how do these people fund the creation of those businesses? How do they come up with hundreds of thousands of dollars for a building or for inventory or for extraction equipment or cultivation equipment or for payrolls, for runway? How do they come up with all of that? These people that have been so negatively impacted by prohibition in the past often don't have the resources to build a business. So then you have to involve somebody else who does have money, right? So who has money? Government, private business owners, usually white people, right? That's what we're complaining about. You either have to include white business owners in a way that they put up the money and then the disadvantaged business owner runs the business. And so you have people that don't want to put up money and not have control. And I can understand that. It's scary. And yet you have licenses that can't be developed because they can't get money. And so that's where government can actually come and step in. And so we're going to talk about Illinois. Illinois offers forgivable loans to social equity marijuana businesses. So this, I think, is such a great idea. Illinois is offering a total of $8.75 million in forgivable loans to conditionally approve social equity marijuana licensees in order to provide immediate access to capital after challenges with a previous loan program. Pending the completion of simplified documentation process, forgivable loan amounts between $50,000 to $500,000 will be released immediately, according to a Thursday news release from Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker and the State Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. Craft growers are eligible for loans of $500,000, infusers can apply for $250,000, and transporters can apply for $50,000. This is awesome. With $500,000, you could actually put together, or at least that if you can't put together a small little grow to start and develop, with that money, you can attract more money to put together the grow that you need to. Same with infusers at $250,000. Transporters, they have the lowest overhead. They don't need facilities so much. What they need is a van. So you can make a down payment on your van and get rolling with $50,000. So this is such a great idea. Here's money to get you going, and then On top of that, the loans have an 18-month grace period with no payments or interest accrued to provide businesses with flexibility, but will carry a 4% interest rate after that. And then if you meet certain criteria, it's forgivable. So it gives them 18 months, a year and a half to not have to make any payments. They're not accruing interest. They can just get their business up and running, get some cash flow, and then they can start paying it back. And then maybe, depending on how they've handled themselves, they might be able to get it forgiven. This is great. I would love to see more programs like this. And if we had more programs like this and more dialogue between the potential recipients of these programs and the people who are trying to develop them and implement them, we'd see a lot more success. But what we're not getting, apparently, from what I'm reading, we're not getting appropriate amounts of dialogue or serious dialogue. Minorities and other disadvantaged groups aren't being seriously included in conversations, and good solutions aren't being offered up. And it feels like we're making very little progress overall. But then a program like this in Illinois is so encouraging to me, and something that we should look at, celebrate, and try to replicate and make it bigger. Let's get $1 million to infusers. So an infuser for $250,000, yeah, you can get the equipment to buy your cannabis distillate or oil and then infuse it into whatever products and then sell it. But you can't really make an actual extraction facility. So what about extraction facilities? What about a forgivable loan of $1 million to help somebody that wants to start an extraction business? So this can be improved upon and expanded, but to me, this is the best example of a social equity program that I have seen to date. Kudos to Illinois on that. I love to see it. So with that, I would encourage everybody to learn more about social equity in cannabis. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me. I am very interested in this topic, and I would love to do anything to promote more diversity, inclusion, and social equity in cannabis. Remember to follow me and see my podcast on YouTube and Spotify. Follow me on Instagram and TikTok and LinkedIn. Thank you, everybody, for listening today, and I hope you have a great one.